Hello. Today we're going to look at Chapter 4 and look at the different kinds of tissues found in the body today. So what are tissues? Tissues are individualized cells in the body. They're very specialized. Different kinds of tissues have different jobs depending on where they're located. And every type of tissue's main job is to maintain homeostasis. If we cannot maintain homeostasis, then that's where, as we've learned in the past, problems occur. So a tissue is actually a group of cells, similar cells that are grouped together. And we have histology. Histology is actually the study of tissues. And when we look at different kinds of tissues under the microscope, we are looking at one of these four basic types of tissues. We could be looking at epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So these types of tissues are found throughout our entire body. Our nervous tissue is found in our brain, our spinal cord, our nerves. Muscle tissue, it causes some kind of movement, whether we have control over it, like skeletal muscle, or we do not, like our heart, like smooth muscle that's found in hollow organs. Our epithelial tissue, they tend to form some kind of boundary. And then we have connective tissues. They help to support and protect our systems. So if we're viewing a tissue under a microscope, it has to be fixed to that slide. It has to be cut thin enough so we can see through it, have light come through it. Then it has to be stained a color so we can see the different parts of the cell. And we look at these different kinds of tissue through an electron microscope or a heavy metal or light microscope. We use light microscopes in our classroom. So here's kind of a look at the two different kinds of microscopes and what kind of view we get. The first picture here is a light microscope. You can see the different parts of the cell somewhat, but while an electron micrograph, it's 3D. We see in more detail what this cell actually looks like. It's kind of cool. So let's start by looking at epithelial tissue. There are many different kinds of epithelial tissue around the body. The main forms of epithelial tissue, they form some kind of covering or lining, like your skin is the best example. It also lines internal surfaces like your intestinal tract. Parts of your respiratory system are made of epithelial tissue. We also have glandular tissue. Glandular tissue it's a gland that secretes some kind of substance, like your salivary glands secrete mucus or saliva that helps to break down different kinds of food. The main function of epithelial cells is protection, absorption, filtration, excretion, and sensory reception. So there's some special characteristics to epithelial cells that kind of distinguish all the epithelial cells in our system from other types of cells, tissues. They all have polarity, where one side is usually more positive, the other side is usually more negative. They have specialized contacts, how they connect with each other, how they connect with cells underneath them. They're all supported by connective tissue. They have the connective tissue underneath the epithelial cells. They're avascular, so there's no blood supply going to the epithelium, but they're innervated, so they have nerves that go to into the epithelium. They're what help you detect hot versus cold weather. They'll let you detect when somebody's touching your skin or some bug is right next to your skin. They also regenerate. All epithelial cells regenerate. So let's look at the polarity. They always have a top and a bottom. They have what is called an apical surface, which is the top. It's the part of the cell that always faces upward. And it's usually exposed to some kind of surface or cavity, like the top layer of your skin is the apical layer of your skin, or the epithelium that is in your digestive tract. The apical surface is what faces that actual inside portion of your intestines, your stomach, your esophagus. So most of those surfaces are kind of smooth for the most part, but some of them have those little microvilli or cilia, those finger-like projections that go up into that surface to help move things along. They also have a basal surface, which is a lower attached side. And that side actually faces towards the body. So it attaches to what is called a basal lamina. And that's actually an adhesive sheet that holds the basal surface of epithelial cells to the underlying cells. Both surfaces have different structures and function. So let's look into some of those. But first, here are some epithelial cells. These cells here create our epithelium. And they are attached to this basement membrane down here. That's that basal layer. Basal at the bottom. Here's our apical layer. This faces the outside or opens up to face the inside of a specific surface. As we said, they have some kind of specialized contact. So they actually contain what are called tight junctions or desmosomes that'll help hold them together. So if I have one cell here, I have another cell next to it, there's actually these little tight junctions between the cells that are holding them together, these desmosomes. These are holding the cells together so things cannot get through. We don't want water to rush through our skin. That would not be safe. All epithelial cells have connective tissue underneath. So underneath the epithelium, we have a basal lamina and a reticular lamina. And that makes up our basement membrane. It helps to reinforce those epithelial cells. It doesn't allow them to stretch as easily and tear. It helps protect us even further. It helps to define that epithelial border too, because it separates the epithelial cells from the connective tissue that's underneath. So we talked about cancer in the last chapter. We're going to talk about cancer again. We have this basement membrane. Normal cells cannot pass this basement membrane. They're all kind of stay on top of this basement membrane here. But cancer cells, they can easily get down underneath this basement membrane and spread wherever they would like to go. So this is a way how skin cancer can spread in our skin, and it's also how cancer spreads in other areas of the body as well. Epithelial cells tissue is avascular. There's no blood supply in it, but we do have nerves. Again, that's how you feel hot or cold. That's how you know something is touching you or coming too close to you, because of the hairs on your arms and legs. They help detect if something is brushing really close to your skin. Epithelial cells regenerate. They have very high regenerative capacity. They're constantly regenerating, because epithelial cells are subject to a lot of friction, a lot of hostile substances. They could be damaged very easily. That's why epithelial cells, since they're usually the lining that covers different places, they need to be able to regenerate fast and efficiently. So they must replace themselves as damage happens. This helps for these epithelial cells to actually keep their function. So here's our example here. We have our basement membrane through here. We see we have a blood vessel. This blood vessel stays in the connective tissue. We have a nerve. This nerve is going up into that epithelial tissue. We have our desmosomes and tight junctions here that are helping to hold the cells together. We have an apical surface on top. We have a basilar surface on the bottom. These are all helping to give this epithelial cells or tissue their specific characteristics. Now that we went over the specific characteristics of epithelia, let's look at the different kinds of epithelial cells. The epithelial cells always have two names. One for the type of cell, and then the second name is the shape of the cell. Or the first one is the layers. So we have a simple epithelia. It's a single layer of cells thick. It's very thin. We'll look at some pictures of what that looks like, versus a stratified. Stratified means there is more than one layer of skin or layer of cells there. Your skin is the best example of that. Your skin is multiple layers of cells, because you're losing lots of cells every day. So these multiple layers are constantly regenerating and moving upwards. Now let's look at the shape of the cells. We have squamous. Squamous is a flat cell. Here's the nucleus here. We have cuboidal cells. They kind of look like a little box. Then we have columnar cells. They're kind of like tall little columns. Epithelial tissue is named for the type of cell that is found at the top. The apical layer is the layer that we use to name the type of cells. The bottom layers may look one way, and then the top layer looks a different way. We use that top layer when we're giving cell epithelial tissue their names. So here, let's look, we have our apical surface and our basilar surface at the bottom. This is a simple, because it is one layer. This one is stratified because there's a lot of layers. And if we look, the cells usually kind of start in a little square-like shape, and then they finish up at the top. They're flat at that apical surface. That apical surface tells us we know it's stratified, but we also know, because that very top layer is a squamous, So we have stratified squamous epithelium versus the top one is simple. The cells are also flat, so they are squamous. So we have simple squamous epithelium up on top and stratified squamous epithelium on the bottom. So here's another example showing the different kinds of cells. So let's look at the different classifications of epithelia. We have our simple squamous epithelium. These again are those flat cells. Simple means it's one layer thick. It's usually found where we need rapid diffusion, like your lungs. Oxygen and carbon dioxide need to move fast through the blood, through the little alveoli, which are the air pockets in your lungs where the actual diffusion process takes place. Kidneys, same thing. It needs to happen fast because kidneys are what's filtering out our blood. So we have two special simple squamous epithelia, and they're based on their location. We have what are called endothelium. Endothelium is lining of like blood vessels, lymphatic vessels in your heart. While mesothelium, it's more of a serous membrane. It's found in different ventral body cavities. So here's in your lung. We see how thin this layer of cells are. This is what lets oxygen and carbon dioxide travel through readily. This helps to get our blood oxygenated, and it helps to get carbon dioxide out of our blood to be breathed out. We have simple cuboidal epithelium. Again, simple, so it's a single layer. Simple cuboidal is found in secretion and absorption areas. So they are found in the ducts of glands and in those kidney tubules because they need to secrete or absorb. Glands tend to do more secretion while the kidney tubules tend to do more absorption. So here are some kidney tubules. You can see there's kind of these little square-like cells. These are simple cuboidal epithelium. This is what lets us absorb and secrete what we do not need or take back in what our body does need. We have simple columnar epithelium. Again, simple. So it's a single layer and they're very closely packed together. Simple columnar is used in absorption and secretion of mucus, enzymes, and other substances. Sometimes simple columnar epithelium have little ciliated cells. So they have those finger-like projections on top. So we're back talking about those again to help move things along. Your digestive tract has a lot of simple columnar, your gallbladder, some glands, the bronchi, and uterine tubes are simple columnar epithelium. So here we're looking at our digestive tract. We have our basement membrane down here. We have lots of columnar epithelium. I'm going to point this out now because it'll make sense later. All of these nuclei, for the most part, are in a single row, straight across. We also see at the top, there's kind of looks like a brush border. It's those little cilia that are helping to move things throughout our intestines. This is why I pointed out the simple columnar, how the nuclei are all in one row, because we also have what is called pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. We say here pseudo means false. So it kind of looks like it's more than one layer, but it's really not. The cells are just different heights, which means their nuclei are actually in different places. Where we have simple or pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium, we use it for secretion of mucus. Also, the movement of mucus via that ciliary sweeping action in the trachea that helps move mucus up. So it's found in that upper respiratory tract, ducts of large glands, and tubules in the testes. So here, this is pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. In general, they have this columnar shape. They're tall. They have the cilia on the top, so they're that ciliated, but their nuclei are all different levels, and they're kind of all over the place. They also contain goblet cells. These are individual cells that secrete mucus. So we have goblet cells throughout, usually pseudo-stratified or columnar epithelium. Let's look at our stratified epithelia. This involves more than one layer of cells. There's two or more. The bottom layer of cells is usually what regenerates. So as cells get pushed off, cells fall off, they're quickly replaced. So we have, this is what our skin is made of, a stratified squamous epithelium. The bottom layer, like I pointed out before, they're kind of a cuboidal shape or even columnar, but that very top surface is squamous. So that's what makes it simple squamous. It's found in areas of high wear and tear, like your skin. Your skin is always undergoing some kind of tension or stress or something. In your skin, these cells are keratinized cells. But if these cells are facing some kind of internal surface, they're non-keratinized, and they're found usually with moist linings inside your body. So here is stratified squamous epithelium. They all kind of connect to this basement membrane down at the bottom. You can see there's lots of layers of cells in this area specifically. But then this is where most of these cells kind of divide, and then they slowly move their way towards the surface, where they will eventually scuff away as new cells will constantly come and replace them. If you notice at the top, the cells are very flat. These very flat areas are what make this simple squamous epithelium. Or stratified squamous epithelium. Sorry, they're stratified because it's many, many layers. We have stratified cuboidal epithelium. It is very rare. So stratified cuboidal is found usually in sweat glands, and there's some mammary glands that contain stratified cuboidal cells. We have stratified columnar epithelium. It's also very limited in the body. There's not many. It can be found in the pharynx, male urethra, and lining some glandular ducts. And it usually occurs in areas of transition from one type of epithelium to another. So here's our simple cuboidal. You can kind of tell it's cuboidal. If you kind of look, here's one cell, here's another cell. The nuclei are sometimes the best way to decide what kind of cell this really is. Here's another one, here's another one. I kind of look at the ones, okay, these nuclei are literally right on top of each other. So there's 2 layers of cells here. This one kind of looks like there's 3 layers of cells here. This is how we kind of determine, okay, it's stratified because there's more than 1 layer here. Most of the time there's only 2, but once in a while you can get more than that. And here's our stratified columnar epithelium. We notice these cells at the bottom, they're more cuboidal, but they get their name because the top layer of cells are columnar. That's what makes stratified columnar, that's what makes it columnar, is because it's the top layer is what cell is what gives it its specific name. We also have what is called transitional epithelium. In transitional epithelium, this type of epithelium is used to stretching. So it looks very different from a lot of the other epithelia because it needs to stretch. So the cells actually stretch. They are found in the bladder, the ureters, and the urethra. That bottom layer is cuboidal or columnar. But as I said, it has the ability to stretch. As more urine enters that bladder needs to stretch. We need more storage space, that bladder gets bigger. So here is your bladder. So you can see there's lots of little layers together. The top layer kind of looks like we got some bubbles here almost. There's lots of little layers of cells in here. And I'll attach to that basement membrane. They stretch. This is unstretched. You can't really get a picture of stretched epithelium or transitional epithelium on a slide. It's kind of not possible. So this is how transitional epithelium kind of looks different from the other types of epithelium. Within epithelium, we also have glandular cells or glandular epithelium. And they're usually 1 or more cells that'll make and secrete some kind of aqueous fluid that's called a secretion. They're kind of classified by the site and how they release, the site of product release. How do these cells release their product? We have endocrine. They're secreted internally. They usually secrete and they end up in the bloodstream, like hormones. We have exocrine. They externally secrete, like sweat. They come out to the skin surface. And they usually have a relative number of cells that form the glands. They can be unicellular, like those goblet cells that we looked at in the intestines with that pseudostratified columnar epithelium, or they can be multicellular, like your salivary glands. So if we look, here's multicellular, this first picture here. These cells kind of invaginate down and they produce some kind of secretion. Here's another one. They have an invagination down again. They have a duct that transports their secretions out of the cell. It's an exocrine gland. Well, the last picture here is an endocrine gland because these cells secrete their hormones into the extracellular fluid that gets taken up into the bloodstream and carried to their target organ. So endocrine glands, as we kind of noticed from the picture before, there's no ducts, so they're ductless. Their secretions are released into that interstitial fluid, which is picked up by the circulatory system. It's usually hormones of some kind. They're usually released by exocytosis. So if you remember those little secretory vesicles that take stuff made inside the cell, it binds to the cell membrane and it releases, it kind of connects to that cell membrane and releases out whatever was inside. That's how hormones are released. And we also have messenger hormones are messenger chemicals that tell our body how to, or cells, how to do something, or organs. Exocrine glands. They're secretions that are on the body's surface. So we get sweat, we get oil, we have salivary glands, we have mucus that all gets produced and are excreted through some sort of excretory or exocrine gland. They can be unicellular or multicellular. A unicellular exocrine gland is one cell that's secreting the mucus or the secretion. We have mucus cells and goblet cells. These are two cells that individually secrete whatever contents or mucus that's inside. It only takes one cell. They're found usually in the intestinal tracts and the respiratory tract. They all produce what is called mucin, which is a sugar protein. It can be dissolved in water to form a mucus, and it's kind of a slimy, and it helps protect. It also lubricates, like in the intestines. It helps to lubricate those intestines. So here's a goblet cell. It's unicellular, so it's one cell that produces all the mucus. We see all these secretory vesicles at the top. This is everything to be released out into the intestines. As it comes to the surface, it starts to get secreted out. So as these start to get secreted out, the next layer moves up, and they just continue to move up. Multicellular exocrine glands are exocrine glands that are composed of a duct and some kind of secretory unit. They're surrounded by connective tissue that supplies blood and nerve fibers to that gland. So there's always nerve to those nerve cells, and they also have some kind of blood supply. They're kind of classified by their structure and how they secrete. There's two different ways that these kinds of exocrine glands actually secrete. So let's look at their structure. Most of them have some kind of tubular secretion. They can have a simple tubular duct where they secrete from the cells at the bottom, or they can have a compound branched tubular system that all kinds of secretes from out to different tubules and out to their surface. We also have what are called alveolar secretory structures. These alveolar structures secrete cells. They form sacs more. As we see here, these cells form sacs. So here's the little sacs at the bottom of each gland here. There are more sacs instead of just, these are tubules. We get sacs. We have simple branched, compound alveolar, and compound tubuloalveolar. You don't need to know the specific kinds of, like the simple tubular versus simple alveolar. But just knowing that there's different kinds of glands out there. They can either secrete what is called merocrine. So it's exocytosis. Again, they have those secretory vesicles that bind with the plasma membrane and secrete their substances out. That's how your sweat comes out. Pancreas. We have holocrine glands that they rupture. That's where the sebaceous oil comes from. Or we have apicrine glands where only the top ruptures off. They're kind of don't know for sure if we even have those in our body as humans, but they might be mammary cells. We don't know. So here's all those secretory vesicles. You see all the little vesicles coming to the top and secreting their substances out into the gland that comes out. That's a Endocrine Gland. While our Hyaline Gland rupture, and they release dead cell fragments out, and that is their actual substance that they release. Let's look at connective tissue. There are many different kinds of connective tissue, and it is actually the most abundant and widely distributed of the primary tissues. It is found all over the body. So the major functions of connective tissue is actually binding support, protecting, insulating, storing fuel, and transporting substances. There's 4 classes of connective tissue: connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. Yes, blood is considered a connective tissue. So let's look at the common characteristics of all connective tissue. They all have a common embryonic origin. They all come from mesenchyme tissue. They all have varying degrees of vascularity. Cartilage is avascular, while bone, on the other hand, is highly vascularized. They have lots of blood vessels going to it, while cartilage has none. The cells are suspended and embedded in an extracellular matrix. So these support cells, they can bear weight, they can withstand tension, they can endure abuse. That is why we have this connective tissue underneath most of our epithelium, just to help. They bear weight like your bones. They help you stand up. They withstand tension. They endure abuse. When you exercise, you're abusing your cells technically, but that helps to rebuild them stronger. So all connective tissue has some kind of ground substance. They contain fibers, and they all have cells. The arrangement is what makes, and the composition of each one is what makes them different. So this is the main materials that make up connective tissue. We have our fibers. We have collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. We have capillaries. We have blood supply to this. We have ground substance, the blue. We have different kinds of cells. We have fat cells, the yellow in here, fats. We have mast cells. We'll find out what those do. We have white blood cells. We have macrophages over here. And yet another kind of white blood cell. The ground substance in majority of connective tissue is some kind of gel-like material that fills in between spaces. It's kind of like a medium which solutes kind of diffuse between those blood capillaries and those cells. That's where everything kind of happens within connective tissue. There's different components of that ground substance. We have that fluid, that interstitial fluid. We have cell adhesion because it helps glue these cells together. We have proteoglycans, which are sugar proteins, which make up the chondroitin sulfate and the hyaluronic acid. We also have water. We need water within our ground substance to help keep everything tensile and keep its shape. So let's look at the different kinds of fibers that are found in connective tissue. We technically have 3 kinds of fibers. We have collagen. Collagen is the strongest and the most abundant. We have the most collagen fibers in connective tissue in our body. They're very tough. They provide us with strength. They hold things together. We have elastic fibers. These elastic fibers help stretch and recoil, so they'll help connective tissue stretch and come back to its original shape. We also have reticular fibers. These are shorter branches of collagen-type fibers, but they form a branching kind of network. So different tissues can give more. They can stretch in multiple directions more. That's what these reticular fibers help to do. We also have what are called blast cells. Blast cells are what creates the different kinds of ground substance of different types of tissue. Fibroblasts makes connective tissue proper. Chondroblasts, chondro means cartilage, so they're found in cartilage. Osteo is bone. Osteoblasts are found in bone, and all three of these help to make ground substance. We also have hemopoietic cells, stem cells, that are found in bone marrow. These are what make the different kinds of blood vessels or blood cells. We also have site cells. They're kind of the more active or less active mature form of blast cells. They help to maintain and monitor the environment, keep the matrix healthy, make sure everything is staying the way it should. Our site cells are kind of the boss. They tell certain cells what to do. We have other types of cells in our connective tissue. We have fat cells. Those fat cells store nutrients. They're a place to go when our body's running low on different kinds of nutrients. We have white blood cells. White blood cells can leave the blood vessels and travel into the connective tissues to do their jobs. We have mast cells. They're what initiate the inflammatory response. When there's foreign organisms in our system, they initiate that inflammatory response that sends our macrophages to phagocytize those organisms. They eat dead cells too. They kind of help to function with the immune system to keep us healthy. They prevent foreign substances getting in our body. So let's look at the 4 types of connective tissue. I have a chart here to make it easier to see. We have our connective tissue is broken down into 4 types: connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. Our connective tissue proper can be separated into loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. We're looking at loose connective tissue. We have areolar, adipose, and reticular. Dense connective tissue, we have dense regular connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and elastic tissue. Cartilage, we have hyaline cartilage and elastic cartilage. We also have fibrocartilage. And then we have bone and we have blood. So let's look at the different kinds of connective tissues. And connective tissue proper, it consists of all the connective tissues except for bone, cartilage, and blood. So we have loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. As we just went over the names for the different ones, we have areolar, adipose, reticular, and then dense connective tissue, we have dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Let's look at our areolar. It's the most widely distributed throughout the body. It's used to support and bind to other tissues. It's packing material. So if you kind of think when you're packing something, when you're packing to move, you're packing your plates in the kitchen or something, it's used to kind of fill in those empty spaces between the plates to help protect them. So it contains fibroblasts. Those fibroblasts secrete the matrix. And it also can act as a water reservoir because it holds more interstitial fluid. We have macrophages. We have fat cells in the spaces. So here is our areolar connective tissue. You see lots of these pink fibers going around. Those pink fibers are collagen fibers. We also have black little stringy fibers going around. Those black stringy fibers are elastic fibers. It gives it that tensile strength. It helps it stretch and return to its normal shape and size. So areolar tissue but it's more spread out. That's what makes it loose. Loose because we see a lot of the ground substance in there. We have adipose tissue. We have two types of fat tissues. We have white fat and brown fat. White fat has a huge nutrient storage. The cells in adipose tissue are called adipocytes. There's very little matrix in there, and there's lots of blood supply because we need to keep those nutrients in those blood cells or in those adipose cells, those adipocytes, healthy because they're storing our nutrients. They're storing everything for later use. Adipose tissue is used for shock absorption, insulation, and energy storage. So think between all of your organs in your abdomen, they're all surrounded by fat or that adipose tissue to help cushion it for shock absorption. Your eyeballs, there is adipose tissue around your eyeballs to help protect them. We also have brown fat. Brown fat is very abundant in babies. That's why they always feel so warm, because that brown fat is used to heat up the bloodstream. So we use brown fat to heat it up instead of producing ATP. So here's our adipose tissue. If we look at our adipose tissue here, we see the nucleus of the cells are actually at the surface. They're pushed all the way to the surface of the cell. And then they're just big white bubbles, is what adipose tissue looks like under the microscope. We also have reticular connective tissue. It's pretty similar to areolar, but the reticular fibers are much thinner collagen fibers. Their fibroblasts actually secrete reticular cells. Those reticular cells are made up of very thin collagen compared to the areolar connective tissue. It's also kind of a mesh. It looks more mixed together. It supports blood cells and lymph nodes, spleen, and bone marrow. So here's our spleen. You can see the reticular fibers are black in this picture. And then there's the other cells, more the white blood cells really, all around. Let's look at our dense connective tissue. We'll see why it's called dense connective tissue when we get to some pictures. We have dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. So our dense regular connective tissue, it's very high tensile strength. It's very strong. So it's in places that need to be very strong, like tendons and ligaments. There's no blood vessels or very little blood vessels that go to your tendons and ligaments. They allow for great pulling. They're so closely packed together, they can stretch and come back to their normal shape. The fibers are kind of wavy. That's why the tendons stretch, but they don't stretch very far because there's not a lot of room to stretch. There's not a lot of cells. You don't really see the ground substance because there's mostly fibers. So here's our dense regular connective tissue. You see lots of long fibers going through here. They're very closely packed together. That is what makes them dense regular, because they are very closely packed together. Our dense irregular connective tissue. There's lots of bundles of collagen in there, but they're not in straight lines like the dense regular connective tissue. They're more kind of all over the place. They form sheets more than bundles. This lets dense irregular connective tissue resist tension from multiple directions, not just one, but multiple directions. So these are found in your dermis, which is the layer underneath your skin. Fibrous joint capsules, like your shoulder, lets your shoulder move in multiple directions. And it's also found in some fibrous coverings of organs. So here's our dense irregular, because it's dense because you do not see the ground substance. That's what makes it dense. But the fibers are going in lots of different directions. The collagen fibers are not all going the same way. Some are going up and down, some are going side to side, they're going some are going at angles, just to help provide that more tensile strength force. Elastic connective tissue. This one is very easy to decipher from the others, because as we saw before, those elastic fibers are very dark. They're black little fibers. They're usually found in places where ligaments need to be some places ligaments need to be very stretchy. So next to the vertebrae in your back, that is actually made of elastic connective tissue, because if they were not elastic connective tissue, you wouldn't be able to move your back, your spine around as freely as you currently do. We also have them in large arteries because they need to stretch as blood is pumped through them. Here's our example. This is our aorta. You see lots and lots of little elastic fibers lined up in rows. This allows this blood vessel to stretch and come back together, and stretch and come back together. Every time the heart pumps blood out of the heart into that aorta, those elastic fibers need to stretch. That aorta needs to stretch. Let's look at cartilage. Cartilage, the matrix of cartilage is actually secreted by chondroblasts during growth. Chondro means cartilage, and then chondrocytes secrete the matrix in adults. Chondrocytes are found in cavities called lacunae. So we have these little lacunae here, and we get these little cells, these chondrocytes in here that secrete the matrix that makes cartilage. About 80% of cartilage is made of water with collagen and chondroitin or hyaluronic acid, which are sugar proteins. They're tough yet flexible material that they don't have nerves. They really don't have nerves. They're also avascular, means they have no blood supply. They get their nutrients from what's around them. That perichondrium supplies their nutrients. That's also what that perichondrium is, where chondroblasts and chondrocytes come from. So we have 3 different types of cartilage. We have hyaline cartilage. It's kind of a bluish color. It's the most abundant in the body. So it's usually found in on the tips of long bones. So like in your elbows, your knees, your ankles, your wrists, those all have hyaline cartilage. Your nose, your trachea, the larynx, the back of your throat, and the cartilage of the ribs. Those are all made of hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage. Again, elastic means it needs to be able to stretch. So it's kind of similar to hyaline cartilage, but it's got a lot more elastic fibers to it. Hyaline cartilage does not have elastic fibers. So elastic cartilage is found in the ears, your epiglottis, which is the back of your throat that opens and closes. We also have fibrocartilage. It's got properties that are between hyaline and dense regular connective tissue. This is what makes up your intervertebral discs in your back that are in your spine. It also makes up the menisci in your knees. So let's look at some hyaline cartilage. Nothing else really looks like hyaline cartilage. You get these cell shapes here with like 2 to 3 cells together. And then when it's dyed, you kind of have this pinkish matrix. These cells are chondrocytes and they're sitting in lacunae. I'm just trying to help you distinguish what makes one cell different from another. Here's our elastic cartilage. As we see, we kind of have these cells dispersed throughout, but we have lots of black elastic fibers also dispersed throughout. And these black elastic fibers are what makes this elastic cartilage versus hyaline cartilage, because it needs to stretch. And our last is fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is our intervertebral discs. That's where this picture is from. It's also the menisci in our knees. We have lots of fibers through here. We have cells, different chondrocytes that are once again found in lacunae. That's why they're all grouped together. We have our collagen fibers that help give our fibrocartilage its tensile strength to withstand pretty strong forces. So since cartilage is avascular, it kind of loses its ability to divide as we get older. So when we get injured, the older you are, the longer it actually takes to heal from an injury. So the other problem as we get older is cartilage could start to calcify or ossify. So cartilage starts to become bony because those chondrocytes actually start to die off. And that's not a good thing. That's why sometimes staying more mobile, older in life, can actually help prevent some of that. Let's look at bone. Bone is also called osseous tissue. Osseous means bone. Bone is what supports body structures, like your ribs actually protect your heart and your lungs. Also, somewhat of your kidneys in the back. They also synthesize blood. They store fat. They have a lot more cartilage or collagen than cartilage. They have inorganic salts. Their matrix is produced by osteoblasts, and those also kind of sit on the cell surface, while osteocytes will sit in the lacunae, and they maintain the matrix of this bone. Bone is arranged into what are called osteons. We'll look at those more when we get to bone tissue later. Bone also has a lot of blood vessels, so it is very, very richly vascularized. So this is what bone looks like. All these little black portions, spots here, are lacunae that house osteocytes. And if you notice, bone has a very circular pattern. These are all individual osteons. Now let's look at blood. Blood is the most atypical kind of connective tissue, just because it has plasma that makes it a fluid. The most common type of blood cell is a red blood cell, but we also have white blood cells and platelets. We also have soluble proteins that are kind of like fibers that help with blood clotting. And they function in the transport and carrying of nutrients, wastes, gases, and other substances around the body. Blood carries wastes to be filtered out by the kidneys. It transports oxygen and carbon dioxide. It helps transport other substances to other parts of the body. So here's our blood. The red cells, the red parts here are red blood cells. They do not have a nucleus, so why the centers are more white or opaque, because there is no nucleus creating that darker center. We also have white blood cells. We don't need to learn the specific names for these white blood cells right now, but these white blood cells are also found in the plasma or the matrix of our connective tissue, blood. We have muscular tissue. Muscular tissue, again, is very highly vascularized. But our muscle helps us move. It also helps our heart move. And it helps our organs move to push things through. We have actin and myosin that help muscles contract, which we will learn the process step by step when we get to the muscle system. We have 3 different kinds of muscle: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is called voluntary muscle. It's the only type of muscle we can actually control. Our brain tells our arms to move. They tell our feet to move, to walk. Skeletal muscle we can consciously control it. Each cell is actually called a muscle fiber. They have multiple nuclei, and they appear striated or banded. So let's look at what that looks like. So here's muscle cells. You can see they kind of have these bands or striations that go down them. This is what separates skeletal muscle from the other types of cardiac and smooth muscle. You can see all of these striations very, very well under the microscope. This is a blood vessel down here. So there's lots of red blood cells here, but these are all nuclei for these different muscle fibers. Cardiac muscle. Cardiac, so it's only found in the heart. We cannot control our heart rate by telling our heart by saying, okay, pump faster or pump slower. We can't do that. So it's involuntary. But it does have striations. But the big difference between those striations is it only has one nucleus. Cardiac cells also branch, and they have what are called intercalated discs, where one cardiac cell will attach to the next cardiac cell. So let's look. We can see here's some intercalated discs. These are connecting one cell to the next. This is the perfect example of how this cell branches here and branches here. That is a great example of branching. That's how you can see, oh, this cell branches into 2 parts. We also have a couple blood vessels in here. But each of these cells only has one nucleus. The nucleus is attached to one individual cell. Smooth muscle. That's another muscle we do not have control over. We cannot tell our intestines to move something through faster or slower. We cannot tell our bladder to stop stretching. So smooth muscle is usually found in the walls of mostly hollow organs. Not our heart, but other hollow organs. Smooth muscle, on the other hand, does not have visible striations. but they're spindle type cells with one nucleus. If we look at this drawing first, you see all the different cells that are connected together to create this smooth muscle. So the smooth muscle here, we see a nucleus. Here's one cell. Here's another cell. These are all several cells branched, connected together. And this is kind of interspersed throughout our it's not interspersed, it's found throughout our digestive tract, found in our other areas of our body, wherever we cannot control it. The last type of tissue in our body, nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is what makes up our brain, our spinal cord, and the nerves throughout our body. Those nerves are what regulates and maintains our homeostasis. It controls function. It controls the nerves in the brain is what controls our smooth muscle. It's not something we can physically tell our muscles to do, but the brain can tell our muscles what to do. Those smooth muscles. We can't consciously do it. Nervous tissue is made up of neurons. Neurons are what sends information to and from the brain. They're usually kind of branched because they talk to several neurons and pass the messages along to several different places. And then there's also supporting cells. We'll talk more about the supporting cells when we get to the nervous system. We're just looking at neurons. The neurons, here's our cell body. We have a nucleus in here. We have an axon with dendrites that come off. We also have, we have lots of neuron processes that come off of these neurons because they connect to each other and talk to each other. They kind of transmit information either from the brain out to the body or from the body into the brain. That is their main job. Along with having different types of tissues around the body, we also have membranes. These membranes surround different areas in the body. And they're usually have an epithelium that is that's bound to connective tissue proper layer. So we have a cutaneous membrane, a mucous membrane, and a serous membrane. Let's look into those real quick. Our cutaneous membrane, that's another name for our skin. It is made up of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, which is known as our epidermis. That's the thick layer, the top layer of your skin. Then underneath it, we have a layer of connective tissue known as our dermis. Your skin is technically a dry membrane. Things cannot penetrate through your skin into the system without breaking it. They cannot squeeze through the cells because it's so many layers thick. By the time it made it to the dermis, it would have been found out and killed. But if something had penetrated through, caused a cut, some kind of injury, that's when things start to get into our bodies, so our immune system will act. So here's our cutaneous membrane that makes up our skin. It's what we physically see. We also have a mucous membrane. And then the mucosa actually indicates where it's at. So it's tend to be called a mucosa, and it lines different body cavities like your digestive tract, your respiratory tract, your urogenital tract. It's a moist membrane. It's the mucous membrane. Mucus is moist if you think of it that way. So it's always got some kind of secretions. It has epithelial cells that lie over loose connective tissue that's called the lamina propria. And it may secrete mucus or it gets mucus from other places. So here's where some of our mucous membranes lie. They tend to lie in our digestive or in our respiratory tract and our digestive tract. So they line that mucosa of the nasal area because your nose tends to secrete mucus that helps take up and get rid of any kind of foreign invaders that we breathe in. It attempts to anyways. We also have what are called serous membranes or serosa. These are found in your body cavities. They consist of two layers of simple squamous epithelium called mesothelium, and they rest on top of a thin layer of areolar connective tissue. There's the two layers to it. One that actually lies on top of that organ, and that's called the Visceral Serosa. And the one that faces the other direction, that faces the outside the body cavity, is called the Parietal Serosa. We'll use these terms for all the time through the rest of this class and next class, because we'll talk about each of these different serous membranes when we get to the different places in the body. So the cavity, there's a small cavity between that parietal and visceral. So here's the heart. I have my visceral layer that's covering right on top of the heart. And then I have my parietal layer that faces the outside. In the middle, we have fluid that helps kind of keep these membranes moist. They kind of help protect the organs too. They're named for their location. Pleura is the lungs. Pericardium is the heart. Peritoneum is the abdomen. So here's pictures that show all of them. We have every single one of them has a visceral and parietal layer, and they're just named for the organs that they're around. Pleura, lungs. Pericardium, heart. Peritoneum is in the abdomen around all those organs. Let's quickly look at how tissue repairs next. When the body's barriers are compromised, the inflammatory and immune responses are activated very quickly. So this happens when anything happens that invades the system. This process is activated and starts very quickly. Those mast cells that we talked about that were in that connective tissue releases its substance that initiates that inflammatory process. So there's 3 steps to the inflammatory process. And as tissues repair, 2 things can happen. We can have regeneration where the original tissue that was there is put back there. So you don't even know something happened. Or we have what is called fibrosis. And that's where connective tissue replaces the destroyed tissue. And that's how we get some kind of scar. So if you have scars around your body, that is where fibrosis occurred. So the first step in tissue repair is actually inflammation. We need inflammation first because inflammation triggers everything to happen. When inflammation starts, our blood vessels dilate. That means more blood can come to the area. We need more blood because our blood is how different things get transported to that tissue repair. That's what causes clotting to occur. So if we look at the first picture, inflammation. These mast cells notice, oh, there's a big cut in the skin. We need to release our chemicals that triggers the inflammation process. That dilates, makes those blood vessels bigger. That sends white blood cells out into that connective tissue. Blood vessels also travel out to that connective tissue to help form a scab and a clot. that covers the area. It protects the area as quick as it can. Step 2, organization occurs. So that blood clot starts to get replaced with granulation tissue. So it's new tissue that's got a lot of capillaries to it. That epithelium that was cut starts to regenerate. More new epithelial cells start to grow. More of those simple squamous cells start to grow and come into the area. Fibroblasts, that makes the connective tissue underneath, actually start secreting collagen fibers. So they start to build that gap, that bridge between the two sections that were cut. So, and any debris gets phagocytized by those macrophages. So here is step 2. We still have our scab at the top, but that epithelial cells down at the bottom here, these are regenerating. We're also getting new collagen fibers through here. We're also have the macrophages, these cells in here, that are phagocytizing that clot. They're breaking it up as the fibers are replacing everything. Step 3, regeneration and fibrosis effect. So that scab eventually detaches when it's no longer needed because the tissues underneath it have repaired. We end up with fibrosis as those collagen fibers connect across the part that this place that was opened. So that fibrous tissue matures more. The epithelium on top of it fills in where that scab was. And that causes, we have that scar tissue underneath, and then we have the epithelium on top of it. Depending on what it is, we may have a scar, we may not. But here is the finished product. This is the fibrosed area that was cut open. We have our epithelial cells that all regenerated all through here, and they covered up over top, but because of this fibrosed area in here, this is what gives us a scar. So any scars that you see on your body, this is where they come from. So different tissues are really good at regenerating, while other tissues cannot regenerate. The tissues that are the best at regenerating are your epithelial tissues. They have to. Your skin is constantly being regenerated. Bone is constantly being broken down and remade. That areolar connective tissue that sits underneath your skin in the dermis, that's constantly being replaced. It needs to. Dense, irregular connective tissue and blood-forming tissue. Those are they all regenerate extremely well. Smooth muscle and dense regular connective tissue can regenerate somewhat well. Cardiac muscle and nervous tissue for the brain and the spinal cord, they really cannot regenerate at all. But they're working on research right now that shows that actually cell division can occur in cardiac muscle and nervous tissue, which is good. It'd be good to have cardiac muscle if we have a heart attack and it kills those cardiac cells to be able to regenerate. Right now they cannot, but they're trying to figure out how to get cells like that to actually regenerate. That's research that is being conducted as we speak. So scar tissue can form in organs like the heart. And as scar tissue gets formed in the heart because of damage, the heart doesn't function as well. It cannot fill up as well. It cannot pump as well. It may interfere with its ability to contract or impair nerve transmissions between the heart, because your heart actually has its own conducting system that causes it to contract on its own. Those scar adhesions can cause the organs to adhere to neighboring structures, which is not good either. We don't need scar tissue to form and attach somewhere else in the body. It can cause organs to stick to something that they shouldn't. That gets very painful from what I've been told. and it can cause organ failure eventually, particularly the heart. And that's not a place we want to have organ failure. Let's look at the developmental aspect of tissues. We have 3 layers of tissues that make up pretty much everything in the body. We have what is called ectoderm. Ectoderm is this blue layer at the top. That's where all of our nervous tissue comes from. So our brain, our spinal cord, our nerves, they all come from the ectoderm. Our mesoderm is the red. That is where our muscles come from. Our connective tissue comes from. While the endoderm in yellow is what lines our digestive tract. So we start, this is an embryo at 16 days old. Everything starts in this kind of embryonic germ layers, this plate, and it turns into a human being. This is all studied through embryology. And tissues tend to function very well through youth and even middle age. As long as it's given a proper diet, healthy foods, not eating junk food all the time, and circulation. But as long as you keep wounds and infections to a minimum, it also affects tissue function. So as the body ages, the epithelia thins, your skin gets thinner. So it's easier for things to get through. Even the internal epithelia gets thinner. Things can get through there. Your tissues don't repair as well. Our bone, muscle, and nervous tissue actually begin to atrophy. They start to break down. DNA can start to mutate. We've talked about DNA mutations a couple times now that significantly increase our risk of cancer. That is everything that I have for today on tissues. Thank you very much. And have a wonderful day.